Tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim! Arra keressük a kérdést, hol lakik a kreativitás? Miért fontos az alkotó és a teremtő munka? Mitől titokzatos az idő? Mit jelent a hűha élmény, áramlat és boldogság? Mit jelent a kreatív környezet, a csodálatos kíváncsiság, a szülői és a családi háttér, a támogató társak, utazás? Hogyan tudjuk láthatóvá tenni a láthatatlant, a vízvezetékszerelő kiválósága, a művészek titkai? És hogyan lehet mindennapi életünket úgy élni, hogy értelmesnek, izgalmaknak, termékenynek legyenek napjaink, azaz boldogok legyünk? A választ megadja Csíkszentmihályi Mihály professzor.
Hát igazán boldog lennék, hogyha 10%-át annak, amit mondták, hogy én teljesíteni tudok ma este, ha 10%-át tudnák tényleg megmagyarázni arról, hogy mi a kreativitásnak a kulcsa, és de hát mégis, mivel hogy már 50 éve tanulom ezt a kérdést, valamit talán tudok ajánlani, vagy segíteni, magyarázni, de az, hogy egy igazi, végleges választ adhatok annak, amit meg lett ígérve a számomra, azt nem tudok többet ajánlani, mint annyit. És először is bocsánat, hogy mostan talán angolra fogok átváltoztatni a beszédemet, mert én 9 éves voltam, mikor utoljára elhagytam Budapestet, és azóta nem volt sok alkalmam beszélni. Az én anyanyelvem magyar volt, de olasz környezetbe éltem, édesapám Fiumei konzul volt, magyar konzul volt Fiumeibe, és én ott Olaszországba éltem. 20 éves koromig, aztán mentem ki Amerikába, és ottan mostan angol és olasz sajnos jobban esik a nyelvemről, mint a magyar, de hát azért minden esetre szeretnék, és nagyon örülök, hogy van alkalmam használni többet magyart, mint volt a 20 évvel, 30 évvel azelőtt, és remélem, hogy a kapcsolatok Magyarországgal tovább is fognak virágozni és nőzni. A gyerekeink, akik nem beszélnek magyarul, nagyon akarnak idejönni, mert annyit hallottak Magyarországról és a családunkról itten, meg a múltról, és ők is jöttek és fognak jönni, és remélem, hogy, amint mondom, ezt fogjuk növekedni ebbe a kapcsolatba. De mostan szól, akkor angolra kezdjük a beszédet. And I would like to explain very briefly why my interest in creativity arose, and my interest really started when I was 9 years old, and we left a station, the Nyugati pályaudvar, to leave Hungary for the last time, and it was October of 1944, and we could hear the guns of the advancing Soviet troops all around the city, and we went back to Italy where my father was working. And during that period, I saw, it was, as a 9-year-old, I was so surprised to see how many of the grown-ups who had high positions in the country, who were well educated and had a lot of experience, had no idea of what was going to happen. They were completely oblivious to the events that were happening around them and that finally would change the whole character and the whole structure of the Hungarian government. And because of that, I was looking for something that would explain what was missing in the life of these people and what made the life of people who were able to live in the society, to make it better for themselves and for the society as a whole. And I became convinced as a young person that it is in our hands whether we have a life which is brutal and short and painful, and a life which is flourishing, that has meaning, has purpose, and leaves a trace of it in future generations. And so creativity is a potential that humans have, just as unfortunately we have the potential to be destructive and cruel and brutal. And it is, I felt that it was in our responsibility as we are growing up to make sure that creativity, rather than the opposite, the destructiveness of the human nature, would be the part of the human potential that we will support. And this is, if we go to the next slide, and we should distinguish two forms of creativity. The form of creativity which is changes the culture, changes the way humanity thinks about the world and about itself, and that's the big C, public creativity. And that is the usual way in which we think about it. But then there is the small c creativity, which is shown in the life of people who never become famous or never get recognized, but which makes the life of those people who use it richer and more livable and more meaningful. I will generally talk more about big C creativity because that's easier to study, and also because from the point of view of society, culture, that's the creativity that we need to be sure not to lose, because that is what keeps culture, a society, lively, healthy, and progressing. So we can go maybe to the next. Obviously, big C creativity is an example here, which is familiar to you, but it's interesting that about 10 years ago we were driving with my family. We were driving in one of the most remote parts of Colorado, up in the Rocky Mountains, where there were no people, cities, as far as you could see there were bears, there were all kinds of animals. But finally, our car overheated and we stopped, and they tried to put water in it. And another car came back and stopped and said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Oh, nothing, it just needs some water." And we started talking. And to my surprise, it turned out that this man who lived there about 15 kilometers away, he was the curator of the Rubik Museum of this little village up in the Rocky Mountain. And so I said, what kind of, and he didn't know much. He knew he was Hungarian Rubik, but he didn't know much about it, but he knew about this magical, marvelous cube that people were playing with everywhere, and they had a collection in an old kind of a stable for horses, but it was kind of nicely painted, and they had cubes from all over the world, and some had the signature from Ernő Rubik and so forth. And they had their, in a way, the imagination and the persistence of these gentlemen here has permeated really as far in the civilized world as you could imagine. And that is the big C, creativity. And that is, there are three elements to big C creativity. One is that it's rare, of course. Creativity is something that is statistically improbable. It's not something that could happen by chance, and it's not happens often. But of course, then it has to be also valued by society, or by some parts of society. And that's where the really interesting issue comes about. Because as my studies have gone more in the direction of trying to figure out why is and how does society recognize novelty, rare events that have a chance of making a difference. Because, for instance, if you read about the history of the Renaissance in Florence, you end up with the conclusion that many historians have come, namely that the Renaissance was really more a creation of the ruling class in Florence at the time than the very, very talented young people, because the talented young people had been there forever, but they never had a chance to have their work appreciated. And the effort that the city of Florence put in choosing architects, painters, sculptors to decorate the city was incredible. I mean, they went to huge pains to find the best painters, the best sculptors, even if these were children who were living out in the countryside, but they showed the talent for drawing and painting and so forth. They would be then schooled and taught how to use the technique and the materials. So, in many ways, the great surge of the culture of the Renaissance, which changed the Western world, was because society found a way to recognize, support, train, and appreciate excellence. There's work that is rare, but it's also unusually well performed. And of course, that work has to then be completed. They have to, having a great idea and then forgetting about it doesn't produce big C creativity. And the introduction to this marvelous little girl who played the flamenco, Baroque flamenco, it says that it takes about 10,000 hours of practice to get to the point where you can achieve mastery of whether it's geometry, biology, or painting, or music. It seems that 10,000 hours of practice are necessary to get to the point of becoming an expert. Not creative, just expert. The creative person is one who is then going beyond expertise. It's going beyond just being a great performer in the craft, but who is able to go beyond it. Let's go to the next slide, please. And it's important to emphasize that creativity is not something that happens in the brain of a person alone. It has to be a synergy of a whole system, and we can go to the next slide. And so big C creativity is one where you change the domain. The domain means the symbolic way of representing some part of reality. And it could be mathematics, it could be physics, biology, music, painting. All of these are domains, separate realms of skill where a person can work in that particular domain and contribute to enriching the experience of the audience, the people who are exposed to the domain. But creativity means also being able to change the domain, to produce something that, or change the rules of the domain, change the way in which you use numbers, the way you use instruments, the way you use colors or sounds. The next slide, if you don't mind. And so creativity means that a person is able to learn to work within a domain, and as I say, to become an expert in a domain is in the order of 10,000 hours, roughly. And then, when you are able to learn that, become an expert, and changing it in the way that people say, yeah, I haven't thought of that, this is a better way of doing it, or this is a new way of doing it, then that's when creativity comes. We can see creativity. It may exist in the head of the person, but you don't know whether it's there or not until the person is able to express it within the rules of a domain, and others will say, oh yeah, that is actually a better way or a new way to express this. The next slide. So we see creativity as interaction of three elements: the culture, which is where the rules and of the domain are embedded. A person who learns those rules and says, yeah, this is great, but maybe I could do it differently. And for instance, when Albert Einstein was asked at the end of his life, why did he go on, what motivated him to come up with the theory of relativity, he answered, and probably it was partly fun answer, but partly true. And he said, I had to come up with the theory of relativity because I could not understand the old physics as it was being taught, you know. And that's, in a way, there is a truth in this, that an expert who finds that there is a hole, there is something missing or something difficult to understand or something wrong in the domain, and says, why don't we try a different way? And that's how all creativity starts, in a sense. Okay, let's look at, the experts are the third elements there, and when a society is not creative, when there is no new ideas being developed, no new products, no new ways of living, usually it's not because there are no smart people who could be creative, but it's because the people who are in charge of the economy and the power of the society don't want the change. In Egypt, Egyptian civilizations for the first 15 or 20 dynasties in Egypt were very creative. And then they decided that because they had become so much more powerful and rich than all the other countries in the Middle East, they would no longer want to change. And the pharaohs of Egypt had a whole office that was in charge of going from one artist to another artist, to one scribe to another scribe, and if they did anything new, they had to be punished, or the object was taken away from them and destroyed. And so the power of Egypt went into preserving the status quo of the culture rather than, as it happened for the first dynasties, was to change and to grow. So the experts have the responsibility, the experts and the leaders of the, in Florence, the people who put the money into the new churches, the new palaces, the new sculptures, the new paintings in the Renaissance were essentially the heads of the big banks, 2 or 3 banks, besides the Medici, the Pitti, and several other families of bankers, and also the heads of the trade unions, the confraternity of the weavers of cloth, the people the workers in the industry of the wool industry, the industry of the silk makers, wool makers. These were everyday workmen who prided themselves in supporting the beauty of the city, and they contributed the money and the expertise of choosing the best painter or architect. And so a society becomes creative when, not just because there are creative people in it, or because it has a tradition in the culture of being creative, but because it has a political system that is able to recognize and support novelty which is worth supporting. And that's not so easy. It's very difficult, and it's very rare that a society gets to the point where it has the means and the political ability to support really good ideas and support novelty. Let's go to the other. This is simply a point that you need to have free attention to achieve anything new. And this neurophysiologists are still arguing how many bits of information can you process, but a good guess is that it's about 500,000 bits of information, and those are things like feeling that you are hot or you are hungry, that you are mad, but it's also information that comes from the environment, information that comes from your memory, from your thoughts, from your imagination. These are all little bits of information that are registered in your brain, and there are about 500,000 of them. And as you see, they are divided, these three major clumps of things that information goes into. And if all of your information is taken up by work, by just keeping warm and fed and clean, and if you use the 1/3 of your waking time doing things that are meaningless and purposeless in free time, then nothing new will happen, and nothing new will be recognized and supported. But I mean, this is an important point, but let's go to the next slide. Here, essentially, this is what I was saying, that the model of creativity for big C creativity involves these three subsystems: the domains that make up the culture, the person that makes up the genetic stock and the environmental influence of the society, and then the fields, which are the experts in society, who are backed by society, and they're the ones who have to decide what new idea the person is producing should be selected out and transmitted into the domain of the culture. And then the culture grows, becomes new, richer, more complex. So the next generation of people get the information from the domain and are able to either just use it for their own sake or produce a novelty. And that's what the creativity is, when the people learn the domains in the culture and then produce a novelty which then the fields recognize and say, yeah, this is worth remembering, this is worth teaching to the children. And then it becomes part of the domain. The next slide. And this model, of course, also applies in smaller systems. For instance, if you think about a firm, about business, or about a school, or whatever, a human system. A human system has a culture of its own, a set of knowledge, procedures, traditions, which are a part of the business of the company or the school. These can be transmitted to the individuals who join the company, and most workers will just want to do it because they want the paycheck and they want to advance, but they don't want to change anything. They just want to keep the system going. But there are some individuals who will say, I think we can improve on the knowledge, procedure, tradition of the company. We can do it differently. And here, the key, of course, is the management of the company, because if they ignore the good ideas from the workers that may change the culture of the company, that will slowly eliminate the company from the ranks of the leaders in the particular business area. or if they accept too many ideas, bad and good ideas, if the balance is not in favor of good ideas, but just novelty for the sake of novelty, that's just as destructive of the future of the company as well. So the management has to have the expertise to select the best ideas and implement them, select them and implement them into the culture. So this is the next level of analysis. We can have the next slide. And this one thing that you learn studying human beings is that we have this, both the need to conserve energy and to repeat things that worked well in the past, eat the same food, speak the same language, be with the people we like, and that is an important part of life, there's no question. But on the other hand, that becomes very stultifying unless you also recognize that we have a tendency to go beyond the limits that we have achieved, and that we want to do things better, faster, with less effort, with greater precision. And these two have to be managed, and for creativity, the second one, of course, is the most difficult to recognize and support. The next slide, if you... yeah, well, this... now we get to the question of what makes a person want to be creative. And they want to be creative because they have recognized this tendency that we all have of trying to do things better, and who learn to enjoy that because they don't do it only because this is advantageous financially or it gives them greater power, but because they want to really understand, they want to really do it better. They want to do it in a way that nobody else has done it and see whether it works better and so forth. And that enjoyment that is present among all creative people I studied is one of the things that I'm most interested in. It's part of this flow experience that has been mentioned before, that I have written about, because flow is, in fact, what we feel when we are doing the best we can do, and we feel that, yeah, this is something that has to be done, I can do it, and I can do it as well or better than anybody else. And when you feel like that, you get support for that from the other people around you. If you feel like that, then you are going to continue to do it, and you are going to achieve things that everybody else would say, yeah, this is great, this is what we need. Okay, the next slide, person. And so flow has these characteristics of clear goals. You want to know what the next step should be. You know what needs to be done. Whether you are a singer or a musician or an athlete or a businessman, you know what the next thing you need to do are. And you get information about whether what you thought is right or wrong, whether what you are trying to achieve is making things better or worse. So clear goals, immediate feedback are two other things. And then for flow, you need to feel that what you can do is more or less balanced with what has to be done. If what has to be done is much higher than what you can do, you feel anxious and confused, and that makes it hard to get into flow. But even harder is when what you have to do is too simple and too boring, because then you kind of get completely bored and disengaged from your work. When these goals are clear, feedback is immediate, there is a balance between challenge and skills, then people begin to focus in, more and more concentration in what they are doing, whether it's music or physics or biology or sports. The focus comes when you know what you have to do, you know whether it's good or bad, and it's within the range of your ability to achieve. When you are in that situation, you forget the future, you forget the past, you are completely in the present, you are just involved in what happens there. You feel that you can do what needs to be done, you don't feel that you have to do it, you don't feel that you can't do it, you just do it, and you feel that, yeah, I think I can do that. And another thing that happens is that time seems to pass very quickly, you don't even notice it, but when it's over, at the end of what you're doing, you look at the watch and half a day has passed. I thought it was half an hour, but it's half a day. And also you forget yourself. You are no longer thinking about yourself with a job, with a payroll, or you don't worry about your careers, you don't worry about your insurance. You just focus completely on what you're doing. Okay, so that's how flow feels, and this is the signature state of creative people when they are working, in a sense. Let's see the next slide. And when I studied hundreds of creative people, as it was said before, many of them were Nobel Prize winners. There were some who got, 4 of the people had 2 Nobel Prizes, some in completely different fields, like Linus Pauling had a Nobel Prize in chemistry and peace. But others had 2 in the same field. But these were people who, during their whole life, had been expanding the domain in which they worked. And one of the things that struck me very much is how, for instance, Linus Pauling, I interviewed him when he was 93 years old, before he died, and he looked like a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, so full of energy and kind of, his mind was going left and right, and he was laughing, he was curious, he was interested. And then when I asked him, for instance, one of the questions was, is there anything that you regret about your life? What is that you regret from your life? And he said, well, I regret that I haven't been more disciplined, that I'm too lazy. I'm too lazy. And here's a 93-year-old man who is still running 2 laboratories in 2 different universities. He has 2 Nobel Prizes, and he feels he's too lazy. And that's because he says, I sleep when I want to sleep, I eat when I want to sleep, when I want to eat, I go out when I want to look at the trees and the sea, and people can't find me, and they feel I should be doing this and that, but I'm too lazy. I want to live according to what I feel I should be doing. And all of these creative people were like that. They were both full of energy and incredible dedication. At the same time, they were led a life that they choose to live, and they didn't worry about what anybody else wanted them to do or so. And this is the interesting thing, that in all of these 10 characteristics, you find that creative people are not in the middle, but are able to go from one extreme to the opposite extreme. For instance, number 2 is convergent thinking, which means the ability to think rationally, mathematically, towards a clear result. But and that's one thing that they have, but at the same time they have also a kind of childish naivete where their ideas kind of go in directions that you wouldn't expect a grown-up to think of, or they sound naive. And for instance, when Wolfgang von Goethe, the great German poet, was asked to explain how come he had become such a genius in German poetry, he said that it's because I still try to maintain my childish naivete. And this is interesting. Again, it's an opposite. You have the ability to think very rationally, very systematically, but you can also think like a poet or a child. And the third point is that all of these people, as you would expect, creative people should be playful, should be open to the world. And yes, they are like that, but at the same time, they're incredibly disciplined and responsible in their work and in their life too. They are not, you expect these creative people to be very undisciplined and irresponsible, but no, many of them, out of the 30 that I ended up writing about in the book, Creativity, there were 6 or 7 who had been imprisoned because they didn't go along with the system. For instance, even Linus Pauling had been arrested because he protested against nuclear proliferation by lying down along the path of a train that was carrying uranium to a nuclear facility, and he lied down across the train, and finally the police came and took him into jail and so forth, and that's he felt responsible. Another person whom we interviewed was Naib Mahfouz, who is the only Nobel Prize winner in literature from Egypt, or any Nobel Prize winner in Egypt. And he was, 3 weeks after we interviewed him, he was knifed on the street by a group of Islamic fundamentalists who thought that he was writing about the doubts of Muslims in Egypt about the future and so forth. So he took, and he was warned over and over that they will punish him for being so anti-fundamental Islamic thinker. And he said, well, I have to say what I believe in, and he was almost killed. He recovered after that. So the fourth point, again, is imagination and reality orientation, and fantasy and reality. Both are important and both are present. And I record, this list actually is an illustration of what Mr. Matolsky and George started out talking about, that creativity is at the kind of very often it's at the limits, at the point where the contrary forces are mixing up, or a new creative synthesis comes up of oppositions, and this is true. And the next one also, we think of the creative people as very introverted, working alone, and that's very true. But at the same time, they are extremely curious about what other people think in the same field as they are. Not because they want to imitate them, but because they are curious to see, maybe they have something I could learn from. And so sociability, even among painters or poets, is very important. And scientists say, many of the scientists I interviewed, they say, if you are thinking by yourself, you can't think very deeply. You have to think with others. And the constant interaction between different minds trained in the same domain are essential. Also, number 6 is ambition. Yeah, we know creative people are often arrogant, ambitious, competitive, and that's true. But at the same time, almost all of these people repeat the saying that Isaac Newton said when he was asked once, Mr. Newton, how come you have seen so far beyond what anybody else had seen after he discovered the laws of gravitation and so forth? And Newton said, well, it's because I was sitting on the shoulders of giants. And that is what all of these people realize, that however much they see far and how deeply they understand, it's only because they are standing on the shoulder of a generation of people before them. And that's part of them. Creative women tend to have the normal feminine grace and virtues of femininity, but they are also very strong and competitive and adventurous. And creative men tend to be more sensitive and interested in the emotional balance of their surrounding than men usually are. So again, here you have, we are trained from children to look at the world through a window which is, if you're a boy, you see one reality. If you're a girl, you are seeing another part of the world. And that's how we train our children. But creative people are able to kind of combine, instead of seeing only part of it, to be able to fulfill the whole potential of human beings and not to be kind of strictly restricted to one view. The same thing is traditional conservative. I mentioned this in the case of people like Mahfouz or Pauling. 9 is very important, especially in the sciences, where you are taught to be detached and objective and rational and cold and cool. But creative scientists are very passionate. They feel that they have a view and a kind of they see something that other people haven't seen, and they would love to see more of it. And they are so excited by the view that they haven't quite seen yet, that they are very involved and similarly, poets, great poets. I translated poems from an Italian Nobel Prize winner poet, Salvatore Quasimodo, and I was translating it into English, and I changed some of the words to be more English sounding than the Italian original. And when I sent it to him, and he looked at it and he sent it back, he said, no, that's not how it was. It wasn't a blackbird, it was a raven. And you know, he was very punctilious about the small parts of the language, about the reality that he wanted to represent. And it wasn't just, you know, feeling and passion, it was very... And then, of course, the 10th point also is a combination of two opposites, which there was a book 50 years or more ago, a bestseller in America about the life of Michelangelo. And the title was, in English, it was The Agony and the Ecstasy. And it reflected these two parts of Michelangelo's life, of this constant feeling of not being quite understood, of not being able to express himself, of having to compromise, having to live in a way he didn't want to live. But on the other hand, the ecstasy he had when he was able to do a work that he felt was an expression of the vision he had to begin with, and it was there in beautiful marble. And this is the life of creative people, is this alternation between agony and ecstasy, of insecurity and suffering on the one hand, because the world is not ready for your ideas, and the feeling of joy and fulfillment that you get from being able to do something that you hoped you could do, but you weren't sure it was possible. So these are the 10 personality traits that I find being typical of people who were creative. And I think I'm talking for too long, so I don't know. Are there more? I didn't put these slides together, so I don't know what comes next, but is there anything? Let's see. I think this is kind of, in many ways, the substance of what I wanted to talk about, namely that as we are thinking about if we want a society that's more creative, that where there is excitement and advance in the culture, human culture, the problem is usually not that there are not people who can think that way. The problem is that there are people who can think that way, but they have no way to express it, they have no support, they have no access to the materials or to the knowledge that is needed to complement their vision. So that first sentence, I think, is to say that if we want creativity, we have to turn into a creative society, like occasionally happens to Athens in the 5th century before Christ, Florence in the 15th century, Anno Domini. And what could happen, I think that the fact that you people chose Pallas Athena as the logo for this meeting, this PAGEO, is a good sign, because it requires a vision of a future which can lead us into a better history, a better phase of humanity than what we have lived through up to now. And this is the challenge, I think, that we have in front of us, to each one person in his own life to find, to be a shaper of creativity by recognizing and supporting the ideas that are worth recognizing and supporting. And if you are lucky enough to be one who is actually contributing the creative idea, so much the better, but you don't need that. What you need is to understand that creativity is the future of mankind, and that in part all of us, each one of us, has a chance to help that to happen. And I wish that the best to PAGEO and to Hungary and to humanity. Okay.